Owen Calloway was 44 years old, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades believing that a man who keeps his word, pays his debts, and shows up without being asked is the kind of man the world quietly depends on. He did not need recognition for this. He was not built for recognition. He was built for the work itself. The slow, careful work of building something that lasts, the kind that does not photograph well and does not make for good dinner conversation, but holds everything else up from underneath. He found out his marriage was over on a Thursday afternoon in November. In the driveway of the house he had helped finance, renovate, and maintain for 11 years. The house in Kanata, west of Ottawa, with the birch trees his wife Nadege had planted when they first moved in, now tall enough to throw shade across the front walk in summer. She told him quietly, without tears, in the kind of voice people use when they have rehearsed something so many times it has stopped feeling like a confession and started feeling like a policy announcement. She had, she said, decided to move forward independently. The inheritance from her uncle's estate, just over $4 million. The sale of commercial property in Montreal that no one had expected to be worth quite so much, had clarified things for her. She felt she was finally in a position to live the life she had always envisioned. She hoped he understood. Theo Calloway stood in the driveway, holding a bag of groceries he had picked up on the way home from the job site. There was a rotisserie chicken in there going cold. He had planned to make soup on the weekend. He looked at her for a long moment. He said nothing. Then he said, "Are you certain this is what you want?" Nadege said yes, she was certain. What she did not know, what she had never once thought to ask about, because she had assumed from the beginning that the money was hers and the planning had been done by her uncle's accountants, and that the legal architecture of wealth was simply not her husband's domain. Was that Theo Calloway had spent 11 months carefully and methodically restructuring the financial foundation of everything she thought she had just inherited. She was stepping off a ledge she did not know was gone. If you have ever been the person in the room who did all the work while someone else took all the credit, stay with this. Because what happens next is going to feel familiar in the best possible way. 11 years earlier, Theo had been 33 years old, freshly licensed as a structural engineer, working for a mid-sized firm in Ottawa's East End. He drove a used Civic with a crack in the passenger side window he kept meaning to repair, and a habit of arriving at job sites before the crew lead showed up, not to impress anyone but because arriving early was simply how he understood respect to work. Respect for the site, for the materials, for the people who trusted you with their structures. He met Nadege at a fundraiser for a Francophone community housing initiative. She was bright, specific, quick to laugh at the right things. She had opinions about architecture she was not shy about sharing, even though her background was in communications. And Theo had found that charming at first, the confidence of someone who has never had cause to doubt their own judgment. Her family was established in Montreal. Old community money, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but sits quietly in property and reputation. Her uncle, Armand Duclos, had built his fortune in commercial real estate across Quebec over 40 years. A disciplined private man who had never married and who regarded his niece with the particular combination of affection and clear-eyed assessment that marks people who love without illusion. Theo and Nadege married after 2 years. He knew, early, that she was someone who had been told since childhood that things would come to her, that the world would organize itself around her arrival. He did not judge her for this. It was not a character flaw so much as a condition, like being raised at altitude and not realizing until you descend that other people are not breathing the same air. The first real test of their marriage came 4 years in, when Nadege's father's small contracting business, a legacy operation, a dozen employees, 40 years of client relationships, hit a crisis. A failed commercial project, a dispute with a subcontractor, and a line of credit called in by a regional bank that had grown impatient. The business was 8 weeks from insolvency. Nadege was devastated. Her father, a proud man named Gerard, had built that business with his own hands and was not equipped, emotionally or practically, to navigate what was happening to it. He had never once asked his son-in-law for help. Theo had never once waited to be asked. He spent 3 weekends analyzing the books at the kitchen table. With a pot of coffee and a yellow legal pad, he restructured the outstanding contracts, personally renegotiated the bank relationship, and brought in 2 colleagues from his firm on a consulting basis. He also, quietly and without mentioning it, until the paperwork was complete, put his own savings into a bridge loan that kept the payroll funded while the restructuring worked its way through. It took 8 months. Gerard's business came out the other side leaner and stable. At the end of it, Gerard shook his son-in-law's hand outside a Tim Hortons on a Sunday morning and said, "In French, you did not have to do that for us." "Yes, I did," Theo said. "Your family." Nadege had cried that night and told him he was the best man she had ever known. She had meant it then. The human capacity for rewriting the past is extraordinary, and psychologists call it motivated revision. The process by which we reshape memories to align with who we need ourselves to believe we are in the present. What Nadege revised, slowly, over the next 7 years was the origin story of her own security. Armand Duclos was diagnosed with a heart condition in the spring of the following year and spent the next 3 years managing it with the same stubborn competence he brought to everything else. He watched his niece closely during this period. He watched the way she began to spend more time in Montreal on extended visits that she described as family obligations, and that he observed, from his particular vantage point of having known her since birth, were something else. He noticed how she spoke about her husband when she thought Armand wasn't paying attention. The slight curl of something dismissive, the way she said Theo's job as though the work of structural engineering, of ensuring that buildings do not collapse on the people inside them, was a charming hobby rather than a discipline. He also noticed Patrice. Patrice Giroux was 41, a financial consultant from Westmount who wore his success the way certain men do, loudly and with a great deal of surface. He had been introduced to Nadege through mutual friends and had, over the course of 18 months, become a near-constant presence in her Montreal social circle. Armand saw them together twice. The second time, he went home and called his personal attorney the following morning. What he then put into motion was the most important structural decision of his life, and he was a man who had made a great many of those. He asked to see Theo alone. It was a Sunday afternoon in late November. The kind of cold that settles into Montreal in the way it means business, not a preview, but the real thing. Armand's apartment on Sherbrooke West was warm and smelled of coffee and old books, and the particular quiet of a man who has organized his life around what matters to him. He sat in the chair by the window with the saint, Lawrence visible as a gray suggestion through the bare trees, and he looked at his niece's husband with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has very little time to waste and has never wasted it. "I want to speak plainly," Armand said. "Please," Theo said. What followed was a 40-minute conversation that Theo would think about, in some form, nearly every day for the next 11 months. Armand had restructured his estate. The $4 million in commercial property value, along with his liquid assets and 1 additional property in Quebec City, had been placed into a discretionary trust with a specific and unusual architecture. The trust was designed to transfer administrative control, not ownership, but control over how the assets could be accessed and deployed, to a named administrator upon the occurrence of 2 trigger events. The first trigger, Armand's death. The second trigger, Nadege's initiation of divorce proceedings. Theo was named as that administrator. This was not a punishment, Armand said carefully. He was not angry at his niece, he loved her. But he had spent 40 years watching what money does to people who have not yet developed the judgment to hold it. And he had decided that the most honest form of love available to him at this point was protection, not of Nadege from the world, but of what he had built from the version of Nadege he feared she was becoming. "The assets are still hers," Armand said. "As administrator, you do not own them. But nothing can be moved, sold, or leveraged without your formal consent while the trust is in the control period." Theo was quiet for a long time. "She's your family," he said. "So are you," Armand said, "more than she has allowed herself to see." Theo looked out at the gray river through the bare trees. "What do you want me to do with this?" Armand's answer was the kind that requires no elaboration once it has been said. "Protect what I built, not from love, but for it." Theo drove back to Ottawa that evening in his used Civic, with the cracked passenger window and the radio set low, and he sat with what he had been given. Not the authority, the weight of it, the responsibility of knowing something this important about the shape of what was coming, and being asked to hold that knowledge quietly until it arrived. He did not tell Nadege. What he did do, beginning the following week, was call a colleague he trusted completely. Her name was Dr. Renata Osi, a property and estates lawyer with a practice in Ottawa's Centretown, who had a reputation among the people who knew her work for documentation so airtight it had never once been successfully challenged. She wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke with the unhurried precision of someone who considers her words to be legal instruments in their own right. Theo laid out the entire situation over 2 evenings at her office: the trust structure, the trigger conditions, Armand's instructions, what he had observed about Nadege's behavior over the past 18 months. Dr. Osi listened without interrupting. She made notes in a small leather notebook. At the end of the second evening, she looked at him over her glasses and said, "How long do you expect before the first trigger event?" "Armand is not well," Theo said. "I think less than a year." She nodded. "And the second?" He was quiet. "I think they may happen close together." "Then we begin immediately," she said. Over the next 11 months, while Theo came home on time and cooked dinner on weekends and drove his used Civic and asked after Nadege's day with the patient attention of a man who has decided that honesty requires a particular kind of stillness, he and Dr. Osi constructed a parallel documentation record that would have been, to anyone looking at it from outside, entirely unremarkable. Routine administrative filings, trust registrations, the quiet, precise language of estate management. Nothing that would raise a flag, everything that would matter. On a Wednesday evening in September, 4 months before the scene in the driveway, Theo's mother called him. Her name was Denise, and she was 68 years old, retired from 31 years of teaching high school French in the Ottawa Valley, possessed of an absolute refusal to soften what she observed when the softening would cost someone something important. She had been in Montreal visiting her sister. She had been at a restaurant in the Plateau Mont Royal when she saw Nadege across the room in a corner table, leaning across toward a man in an expensive suit in a way that did not leave much room for interpretation. Denise Calloway went home, made herself a cup of tea, and texted her son 4 words, "Il faut qu'on parle." Theo was in his truck in the parking lot of a hardware store when the message arrived. He read it. He sat for a while with the engine idling and the heater running. Then he replied, "Je sais, maman, je suis prêt." He was not performing readiness. Readiness, by that point, was simply the accurate description of his condition. Armand Duclos passed away in early October. A private service in Montreal, fewer than 30 people. Theo sat beside Nadege and held her hand when she cried. Genuinely and without reservation, because whatever else was true, this was her grief and he would not withhold himself from it. After the service, the estate attorney confirmed that the trust had transferred to its control period effective immediately. Theo was now its administrator. He texted Dr. Osi 1 line, "Premia déclenche confirmé." She replied, "Documents ready on your instruction." And then, 6 weeks later, the driveway. The birch trees that Nadege had planted 11 years ago, now tall and bare in the November cold. The rotisserie chicken going cold in the grocery bag. The careful, rehearsed voice of a woman who had decided that $4 million Dollars meant she no longer needed to pretend to want the same things as the man standing in front of her. Theo drove to his mother's house that night in Orléans and sat at the kitchen table where he had done his homework as a teenager and ate the soup she made from the grocery bag he had brought. Because Denise was not the kind of woman who let good food go to waste or her son go hungry on a difficult night. She sat across from him and watched him eat and did not say anything until the soup was gone. Then she said, in English, because her English came out when she wanted something to land clearly, "That woman has made a very costly mistake." Theo looked at his mother. "She has," he said. "She just doesn't know it yet." What happened 2 weeks later, the evening Nadege organized to close the chapter publicly and permanently, is something worth understanding slowly, because it did not unfold the way she expected. Nothing that night unfolded the way she expected. Nadege had, in the 2 weeks since the driveway conversation, moved with the efficient speed of someone who had been planning for much longer than they had let on. She retained a family lawyer in Ottawa and filed preliminary separation documents. She told her friends, in Montreal, in Ottawa, in the overlapping social circles where she had spent the last several years carefully repositioning herself, that the marriage was over and that she was beginning the next chapter of her life with the inheritance that was rightfully hers. She said this in a particular way that implied the inheritance was the enabling condition of an independence she had always deserved, and that Theo had somehow been the obstacle to it. Patrice Giroux was, by now, no longer a secret to anyone who had been paying attention. Nadege organized what she called a transition dinner, a private event at a restaurant in the Glebe, upscale, the kind of place where the wine list is longer than the food menu, and the lighting makes everyone look like they have good news. 14 guests, her closest friends from both cities, her cousin from Laval, the family lawyer who had handled the separation filing. The intent was to mark the formal beginning of her new life. She had her assistant contact Theo's lawyer to confirm that the final separation agreement would be available for his signature at the dinner. Not at the office, at the restaurant, at the table. In front of the people she had chosen to witness it, she wanted the room to see him sign. When her assistant confirmed that Theo had agreed to attend, Nadege told her, "Good. Tell him the table is reserved for 9 o'clock." Theo spent that Saturday at his mother's house in Orléans. Denise made cretons on toast for breakfast, the recipe that had been in the family since before Theo was born. He sat at the kitchen table and watched her work, and the two of them talked about small things. The neighbor's new dog, a plumbing repair she had been putting off, whether the winter was going to come early this year, and did not talk about the evening ahead until she brought it up herself, which she did by setting a cup of coffee in front of him and sitting down and saying simply, "How are you feeling about tonight?" "Sad," Theo said, "not nervous, just sad." She looked at him with the reading look that only certain mothers develop, the one that takes decades and requires genuine attention to the person being read. "That's the right answer," she said. "Nervous would mean you weren't sure. Sad means you know exactly what's been lost." She put her hand on his briefly. "Your father would have been proud of how you've handled this," she said, "and Armand knew what he was doing when he chose you." Theo put his hand over hers and held it there for a moment. Then he finished his coffee and went to get ready. He arrived at the restaurant at 10 minutes to 9. He had driven himself in the used Civic. He was wearing a gray wool blazer over a dark shirt, no tie, unhurried. At his side was Dr. Renata Ose, with her briefcase and her reading glasses on their chain, and the particular quality of composure that comes from being the most prepared person in any room she enters. The restaurant was warm and full and arranged precisely as Nadege had intended. Intimate lighting, a long table at the center of the private section, the guests already seated and already into their first glass of wine. Theo felt the room register his entrance before he was halfway across it. Conversations adjusted, eyes tracked. He recognized several people at the table, acquaintances, people he had met at dinners and parties over the years, one woman who had been at his wedding. He moved through the room the way he moved through complicated job sites. Steady pace, clear attention, no urgency. Nadege saw him from across the table, and her expression did what it always did when something happened outside her plan. It recalculated quickly, but not quickly enough to prevent the moment of recalibration from being visible to anyone watching. She rose and crossed toward him with a glass of wine and the wide, composed smile of a woman who has decided to stage manage every detail of her own story. "Theo," she said, "I didn't think you'd actually come. You asked me," he said. "I came." She gestured toward the documents envelope visible on the corner of the table. "The papers are ready. It's a simple process. We can have everything done before dessert." Theo looked at her steadily. Not with coldness, not with performance, with the kind of direct, unhurried attention that is, in its own way, more clarifying than anger. "Before we get to that," he said, his voice low and even, not projecting but carrying, "I want to ask you one question." She tilted her head in the way that indicated she was willing to be briefly patient. "You've told everyone here, your friends, your lawyer, your family, that you've inherited $4 million from your uncle's estate. I want to ask, do you understand what the structure of that inheritance actually is?" The table, which had been murmuring with the ambient warmth of a social gathering, became noticeably quieter. Rooms do this when they sense that something real is about to happen, and something in the shift of tone at the head of the table had communicated itself across the private section. Nadege's smile thinned. "It's a trust distribution. Armand's estate, managed through his attorney. I've spoken with the executor, with the estate attorney," Theo said. "Not with the trust administrator. They're the same." "They're not," Theo said. He looked at Dr. Osi. Dr. Renata Osi did not hurry. She placed the briefcase on the edge of the table, opened it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this kind of work for 22 years, and began placing documents in a clean row across the white linen cloth. Tabbed, organized, professionally bound. "Armand Duclos's estate was restructured 14 months ago," she said, in the tone of someone reading a patient's chart, not cold, but precise, because precision is the form of respect the situation requires. "The primary assets were transferred into a discretionary trust with 2 administrative trigger conditions. Upon both triggers occurring, Mr. Duclos's death and the initiation of divorce proceedings, administrative control over all trust assets transferred to the named administrator." She set a document forward. "That administrator is Theo Calloway." The room was very still now. Nadege looked at the document, then at Theo. "What does that mean?" Her voice had lost its social register. She was asking a real question. "It means," Dr. Osi said with neither pleasure nor apology, "that without Theo Calloway's written consent, not $1 of that trust can be moved, sold, accessed, or leveraged. The assets remain in the trust. They are effectively frozen until the administrative control period concludes, which under the terms of the trust requires his formal release." She placed a second set of documents beside the first. "There is a separate matter as well. Over the past 14 months, Mr. Calloway, acting in his administrative capacity, has completed a formal review of all trust-adjacent accounts. During that review, documentation was identified showing that approximately $260,000 was transferred from a joint family account, an account funded significantly by Mr. Calloway's income, into a private account registered to Patrice Giroux, structured across smaller increments over an 8-month period. The room broke open in the particular way that quiet, composed rooms break, not loudly, but completely. The collective sound of 14 people absorbing information simultaneously is its own kind of event. Glasses set down, a quick intake of breath from the woman nearest the documents. The family lawyer leaning forward with an expression that had moved from professional to personal in about 3 seconds. Patrice Giroux, who had been sitting 2 seats to Nadege's left, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being the best-dressed person in any room, had gone the specific shade of pale that belongs to people whose calculations have just been publicly invalidated. He looked at the documents. He looked at the exit. Nadege had not moved. She was looking at the papers on the table with the expression of someone trying to find the error in a problem that does not contain one. Armand would not have done this, she said. Her voice was controlled but thinner now, stripped of its presentation layer. He would not have. Your uncle loved you, Theo said quietly. He told me that. He also told me that he knew you, really knew you, and that the most honest thing he could do for you was not to simply hand you something you hadn't learned to carry yet. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer. What he removed was an envelope, cream-colored, the kind of heavy stock that was Armand Duclos's preference for correspondence. Anyone at that table who had ever received a note from Armand in the 40 years he had been part of their lives would have recognized the envelope before they registered the handwriting on the front. The handwriting itself was unmistakable, precise, upright, old-fashioned Quebecois script, each letter shaped with the care of a man who had learned penmanship from nuns in a one-room schoolhouse in Laurentides and had never seen a reason to abandon it. On the front, in Armand's hand, 3 words, pour celui qui reste, for the one who stays. 2 of the guests at the table recognized the phrase before the envelope was open. One of them, a woman in her 70s who had known Armand since before Nadege was born, pressed her fingers to her lips. Theo opened the envelope. He unfolded the letter inside, 2 pages, handwritten, the ink slightly faded at the folds from having been handled and refolded many times over 11 months. He cleared his throat once for the acoustics of the room, not for emotion, and he began to read. His voice was low, completely steady. Theo, mon fils, if you are reading this aloud, it means the thing I feared has happened. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for you, and I am sorry for Nadege, because I know better than anyone what she is throwing away, even if she has not yet understood it herself. No one at the table moved. I built everything I have from nothing. From a 2-room house in Saint Donat and a father who told me the only inheritance worth leaving was one that had been honestly earned. I spent 40 years proving him right. I nearly lost it twice, once to a bad partnership, once to my own pride. Both times, I survived because someone I trusted told me the truth when I did not want to hear it. You have been that person for this family for 11 years. Not loudly, not with conditions. You saved Gerard's business when you had no obligation to do so. You showed up every time. You fixed what was broken before anyone noticed it was broken. And you did not keep a tally. Theo glanced up briefly, not at Nadege, at the older guests, the ones who had known Armand for decades, who had received letters in this handwriting, who understood what it meant to be included in a document like this. Several of them were nodding slowly. I cannot leave what I built to be consumed by someone who does not yet understand what it cost. That is not cruelty. That is clarity. Real love does not simply give. It protects. It asks whether the person it loves is ready to hold what they are being given. Nadege is my heart. She has been since the day she was born. But a father's love, an uncle's love, does not require us to pretend we do not see what we see. He turned the page. If she has removed you from this family, let her know this. What I built was never meant to fund a performance. It was meant to pass to someone with the patience and the honesty to protect it for the next generation. That is you. It has always been you. I knew it the first time I watched you stay late at Gerard's office on a Tuesday night reworking loan documents that were not your problem. Take care of what we built, the right way, at the right speed for the right reasons. You always have. I am proud to call you my son. Armand Duclos. The room held the silence for several seconds. Then Nadege moved. It was sudden. The lunge of someone who has been very still for a long time and can no longer sustain it. She reached across the table for the letter with both hands, as though taking it could undo what had already entered the room, what had already settled into the understanding of every person seated there. Her wine glass went over. Red wine spread across the white linen in a slow fan, and her chair caught the edge of the table as she pushed back, and she went down to one knee before she caught herself on the tablecloth, pulling a section of it with her, and there was a sound from the table, not words, not drama, just the collective breath of a room watching something that cannot be unseen. She was on her knees on the restaurant floor, with one hand on the edge of the table and the red wine spreading above her, and the sound that came out of her then was not the social version of grief. It was not performed. It was the sound of a person who has finally understood, fully and too late, the actual dimensions of what they have destroyed. Her cousin from Laval got up from his chair and came to help her. One of her friends from Montreal went for a staff member. The room rearranged itself around the reality of what was happening, because decent people in a room like this do not simply watch someone fall and leave them there. Across the table, Patrice Giroux had already risen from his seat and was moving toward the restaurant's side exit, with the specific controlled pace of a man trying to leave without appearing to flee. He was 4 steps from the door when he noticed the 2 men standing in the corridor outside it. Restaurant staff, technically, though their posture communicated something more deliberate. Dr. Osi had, with her characteristic thoroughness, made a quiet call to the restaurant manager that afternoon. Patrice stopped. He looked at Dr. Osi. She looked back at him over her reading glasses with the composed, patient expression of someone who had anticipated this exact moment and built it into the evening's structure 3 weeks in advance. He stayed. A staff member helped Nadege into her chair. She was not composed. She was past composure. She looked across the table at Theo with the full-weight look of someone who has abandoned performance entirely, and what she was searching his face for. Satisfaction, anger, the particular cruelty of a man who has won and wants the other person to feel the full weight of it. She did not find. What she found instead was sorrow. The kind that has been carried a long time and set down not with triumph, but with the exhausted relief of a person who has finally reached the end of something. "You planned all of this," she said. "No," Theo said. "Your uncle planned it. I honored it." He held her gaze for a moment. "I did not do this to punish you, Nadege. I did this because a man I respected asked me to protect what he spent his life building. That's all." He looked at her one final time. The honest look of a man completing a farewell he had already made peace with privately. And then he folded the letter, returned it to its envelope, and placed it in his breast pocket. Then he nodded at Dr. Osi. She was already on her phone. The family lawyer remained at the table. The other guests sat with the particular quiet of people who have witnessed something that will not be easily discussed afterward. Not because it was shameful, but because it was too real for casual retelling. Theo walked out into the November cold. The glebe was quiet at that hour. The canal would be starting to freeze at the edges. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with his hands in his pockets and the cold air on his face, and he felt, for the first time in 11 months, the clean, specific stillness of something finished. The legal proceedings that followed were efficient, in the way that proceedings are when the documentation is organized and one party has nothing viable to contest. Dr. Osi filed the family law motion and the civil fraud complaint on the Monday following the dinner. The forensic trail of the $260,000 was documented across 47 pages of bank records, wire confirmations, and account registration filings. Patrice Giroux retained a defense attorney. Nadege retained 2 over 3 weeks and parted ways with both. The Ontario court issued its order 6 weeks later. Both were directed to repay the full amount with penalties and legal costs. Non-compliance would trigger criminal charges. There was no viable appeal. The financial consultant Patrice Giroux had built his practice on personal relationships and the appearance of discreet competence. Neither survived public documentation of what he had done. Several clients quietly moved their accounts. 2 filed their own complaints. His practice did not outlast the winter. Nadege paid. It required selling things. The SUV she had leased 3 months earlier in anticipation of her new life, a trip she had already booked for January, jewelry she had purchased in the weeks after Armand's funeral. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Vanier, a reasonable apartment, a clean building in a fine neighborhood. The kind of place she would have called, without thinking about it, not for someone like her 18 months ago. The separation was finalized through attorneys on a Tuesday morning in March. Theo signed the papers in Dr. Ossi's office, using the same kind of plain ballpoint he used for structural review documents. He set the pen down and looked across the desk at her. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him over her glasses. "You built this," she said. "I documented it." "Still," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. For Dr. Osei, what followed was the professional equivalent of the highest compliment she knew how to give. She allowed herself a single, brief nod. 3 weeks after the court order, Nadej's remaining lawyer mentioned on a routine procedural call that his client had a personal question she wished to pass along. Off the record, Nadej had seen something, a photograph posted by a guest at the restaurant that evening, not posted maliciously, simply the way people document significant moments. It was a candid shot taken outside the restaurant before Theo went in. He was standing near the Civic, calm, looking at his phone, and visible through the passenger window behind him, sitting reading, was a woman with close-cut gray hair and the kind of settled, unhurried presence that registers even in a background detail. Nadej's question, passed through her lawyer, was, "Who is that?" Her name was Dr. Simona Chebe, 46 years old, a civil engineer at a firm in Gloucester who had met Theo at a professional development conference in Ottawa 7 years ago, when he had asked a question during a session on foundation load distribution that she had found so precise and so genuinely curious that she had introduced herself afterward, and they had talked for 40 minutes in the conference center lobby about soil-bearing capacity and, eventually, about what it meant to build something meant to last. She had thought about him, carefully, for 7 years. Not urgently, not uselessly. The way an engineer thinks about a problem they respect, with patience and without pressure, holding it at the right distance until the time is correct. Theo had called her on a Friday evening in October, 5 days after returning from Armand's funeral. She had been reviewing project drawings at her kitchen table. He had said, "I don't know if you remember our conversation in Ottawa," she said. "I remember exactly which session you were in and what you asked." They had seen each other every week since then. Steadily, without performance. 2 people who had both spent long careers in the discipline of understanding what holds things up, building something between them at the right pace and in the right order. They were not yet engaged, but they had, on a quiet Sunday in February, looked at the structural drawings for a small renovation he was planning on a property he now held outright, a cottage in the Ottawa region that had been part of Armand's estate and had transferred to Theo's administrative authority, and she had made 2 suggestions that he had immediately recognized as correct, and he had looked at her across the drafting table and thought, with the particular clarity available only to people who have been wrong about something important and learned from it. This is what it is supposed to feel like. Nadej received the answer to her question in writing through Dr. Ossi's office. Dr. Simone Achebe, a colleague, a friend, someone I've known for some time. No additional information was provided. None was required. She read it in her apartment in Vanier on a Saturday morning, sitting at a kitchen table she had bought second-hand. She read it twice. Then she put it down on the table and sat for a long time looking out at the parking lot below, which was ordinary and gray and entirely unremarkable. And she thought about something her uncle Armand had told her years ago when she had been careless with someone's kindness and dismissed it as something smaller than it was. "Nadej," he had said, "the ones who don't need to tell you how important they are, those are the ones you need to pay attention to." She had not paid attention. The morning after the court order was finalized, Theo drove out to the Odaways' cottage in the used Civic he still hadn't traded in. The cracked passenger window had been repaired, finally, by a mechanic in Orléans. He got there before 7 o'clock. The lake was gray and flat in the early light, and the birch trees along the waterline still held their pale bark against the March cold, patient the way birch trees are, waiting for something they already know is coming. He made coffee in the kitchen with the French press. Simone had brought on her second visit and left on the counter with the quiet authority of someone who intends to return. He took the mug out to the dock and stood there with his father's old Omega watch in his free hand. A watch that had survived 30 years of construction sites and one difficult marriage, and had continued to keep accurate time throughout all of it, and he turned it over once, wound it slowly, listened to the small, precise movement of a mechanism that does not require acknowledgement to function correctly. He looked out at the lake. He thought about his father, about Armand, about what it costs a person to be consistently present, to show up without being asked, to fix what needs fixing before anyone notices it was broken, to build things meant to outlast the moment, to do all of that without a ledger and without expectation, because that is simply who you are. He said it quietly, to the lake and to the cold morning air, and to no one in particular. Je l'ai, Armand. The dock shifted slightly under his feet. A bird called once from somewhere in the birch trees. The lake held its stillness. He heard the car on the gravel behind the cottage, then the sound of the kitchen door, then footsteps on the dock boards. Simone came to stand beside him. She was wearing his winter jacket over her own sweater, which she had borrowed without asking because it was cold, and it was there. She had a second mug of coffee. She had brought two, because she always brought two, because she paid attention to the small things and always had, and she handed it to him without saying anything. They stood like that for a while. The lake, the birch trees, the particular quality of early morning in the Outaouais in late winter, when everything is very still and the light comes sideways off the water and the cold is the kind that wakes you up properly. Then she said, "The property survey you ordered. It came back, and the eastern boundary is about 3 meters further than the original deed indicated." She paused. "You own more than you thought." He looked at her. She met his eyes with the direct, quietly amused expression of someone who has made a good structural observation and is waiting to see if the engineer appreciates it. He laughed. A real one, from somewhere below the ribs, the kind that had been somewhat scarce for a year, and was now, slowly and unmistakably, coming back. "Of course it is," he said. His mother arrived at noon, as Denise Calloway always did when she felt her presence was warranted, without announcement and with food. A tourtière this time, properly made, the crust done correctly, carried in the same enamel dish she had owned since before Theo was born. She set it on the kitchen counter and looked around the cottage, which was simple and honest, and entirely itself, and said nothing for a moment. Then she looked at her son and at the woman standing beside him, and she nodded once, the nod that Theo had understood his entire life to mean. "This is right." She set down the dish towel and walked over and put both hands on her son's face, the way she had since he was small, and held it. "I'm proud of you," she said. "You always say that. I'll keep saying it until you stop needing to hear it." She released him and turned to Simone, with the frank warmth of a woman who has decided something and sees no reason to delay it. "Now, tell me what you think about the kitchen layout in here, because I have opinions, and I have been waiting for someone with actual professional credentials to weigh in." Simone, who had known Denise for approximately 4 months and already understood her completely, pulled out her phone. "I was going to suggest moving the window," she said. "Finally," Denise said, "someone who sees it." Later that afternoon, while Denise and Simone debated the structural merits of a south-facing window extension, with the cheerful focus of two people who have found each other genuinely useful, Theo stood alone at the end of the dock with the Omega watch in his palm and the lake quiet in front of him. He let himself think about Nadege, not with bitterness, not with satisfaction, with the honest, quiet grief of a man who had loved someone for a long time and watched them make choices he could not unmake for them, and had eventually accepted that you cannot protect someone from themselves. You can only protect what has been entrusted to you. He did not hate her. He did not wish her harm beyond what she had brought on herself. He simply accepted, with the full settled weight of a man who no longer needed to prove anything, what was true. She had held something rare and treated it like furniture. She had looked at a man building a careful and honest life beside her and seen only a man standing still. She had mistaken his patience for absence. She had mistaken his quiet for emptiness. What she had not understood, and what Armand had understood from the beginning, was that the most important structures are almost always invisible. The ones that hold everything else up from below, that do not announce themselves, that simply function year after year without requiring anyone to notice. Theo wound the watch one last time, listened to it tick, tucked it into the pocket of his jacket. Then he went inside to join his family. There are 3 things worth taking from this story, not as lessons in the instructional sense, but as observations worth sitting with. The first, before anyone in your family accepts an inheritance, a trust distribution, or a significant financial transfer, read the actual documents yourself, not a summary, not a reassurance from the other party's lawyer. Hire your own independent attorney, someone with no existing relationship to the estate, and understand precisely what you are receiving and what conditions it carries. Nadege inherited $4 million and never once asked whether someone else held administrative authority over how it could be accessed. That question, asked once, would have changed everything. The second, the people in your life who show up quietly, who renegotiate the loan you didn't ask them to renegotiate, who stay late solving the problem that isn't technically theirs, who fix the thing that was broken before you noticed it was broken. Those people are the architecture of your life. They are not decoration. They are the load-bearing walls. Check in with one of them this week. Not by text, a call, or better, in person. Tell them specifically what they have carried that you have not acknowledged, before it is too late to say it while they can still hear it. The third, greed moves quietly at first. It borrows in small amounts. It explains itself in reasonable language. It does not announce itself as greed. It announces itself as opportunity, as clarity, as finally understanding what you deserve. By the time it is loud, it has already done most of its damage. Trust what you notice early. Armand noticed. He had the wisdom to act on it in time. Most of us are not that organized. Start paying attention now, before the documents are signed. This story was written to remind anyone who needed reminding that patience is not passivity, and that a quiet person moving carefully in the background of your life may be the most important person in it.